Well, hello, everyone. My guest this week is David Bornstein, who is the author of the Fixes column, among many other things, for the New York Times, author of a book that really changed the way we think about social entrepreneurship and solving social problems called How to Change the World, Social Entrepreneurs and the Power of New Ideas. And today we're going to be focusing, I suspect, on the Social Solutions Journalism Network, which he co-founded and is very much involved with driving. So David, welcome.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. So maybe we start with your journey. How did you get to be so interested in this topic?
The social entrepreneurship or the solutions journalism, or both?
Oh, both. Yeah. I mean, they seem to me to be part of a continuum.
Yeah. Well, I started as a journalist many years ago. I started in the early 90s, so almost 30 years ago. And, it was while I was working as a daily reporter for New York Newsday, I was covering a lot of murders. It was the rise of, at the time, New York was peaking in terms of the murder rate that it had ever had. It was, of course, the rise of AIDS and so forth. Many of the stories that I was telling were, telling people things that they already knew, that they were already stressed about. And it was then that I heard about the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh, which at that point was not, a household name. It was long before they had won the Nobel Prize and so forth. And I actually just got so interested in it that I went to Bangladesh, and I ended up spending a year there over a 2-year period, and wrote a book about the bank and Muhammad Yunus, and also the idea of how you take an idea like microfinance and turn it into an institution that can serve millions of people. Like, how do you actually do that and make it work? And that was the question mark in my mind. And that was really where the original idea of talking about people who are creating institutions that are improving the world, destabilizing the world, but in a good way, if you could think of it that way. And then also really thinking about how to tell those stories and how to make them newsworthy, not just feel good or fluffy stories.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I love that emphasis. So let's stick with social entrepreneurship for a minute, because it was very much in vogue, what, about 10 years ago? And you hear a lot less about it now, although I think it's become much more practical now. I mean, people talk about the fortune at the bottom of the pyramid and how you can, create these self-reinforcing cycles. But I think the idea of, well, maybe we should start with, how is social entrepreneurship different in your view from regular entrepreneurship?
I don't really think that there's much of a difference. I think the importance of social entrepreneurship, especially when Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, started defining it and describing it, he was able to show that the process of entrepreneurship had been a really important organizing mechanism for the private sector, in terms of how do we understand the kinds of ingredients, the kinds of forces, the kinds of talent it takes to launch and build great businesses. And so you had a whole century of sort of academic thought, economic thought focused on the role of the entrepreneur in the private sector. Meanwhile, there were all of these things around the world emerging, especially in the 80s and 90s, where people were inventing new institutions to deal with the environmental, at that time, the emerging environmental crisis, all sorts of crises or needs around human rights, whether it was gay rights or the rights of other vulnerable people and so forth. And he said, these people are behaving in many ways like the entrepreneurs that we have characterized in the business literature. It's just that the role is not well defined. The kind of services they need don't exist, especially the financial services and the network services. So the idea was like, there are people out there who love to build things. Sometimes they want to build businesses to maximize profit. And sometimes they want to build social institutions to maximize some sort of form of social impact. In many cases, they have similar ways of thinking about things and similar ways of approaching problem solving, and you need them all, And so the idea that entrepreneurship is a force for, harnessing people's energy, harnessing financial energy, bringing it together to produce some sort of new value in society, and I think it's pretty simple. I think now it's been mainstream, so I don't think the innovation or the need for the term is as important. It should dissolve at some point, because entrepreneurship will just merge again.
With everything, right? I mean, one of the things you do tell in the book is the incredible energy that a lot of these social entrepreneurs have, that it's just all consuming, that they really, and I think the same could be said for business entrepreneurs, but in this case, they're really just absorbed with having to solve this problem, that I think is very compelling. And Eunice certainly would be a case in point of, if I recall the story, he's kind of a middle class banker type when he stumbled across this idea for microfinance, which did in fact change the world.
Well, he was an economics professor. He
Mhm.
he studied at Vanderbilt University, and then when he moved back to Bangladesh, he was teaching economics at a university. His original experiment for the Grameen Bank was a student experiment. He worked with his economics students, said, go into the village, figure out what helps. If we can't figure out what helps people, his university was located, he had to walk through a village to get to his university office. So he said, if we can't help the people living right here, what's the value of the theories we're teaching in the ivory tower? And so years of class experiments, microfinance was just one of many, many things he tried. That was the thing that stuck. And that's the thing. And the original, like some of the leaders in the Grameen Bank are still his original grad students,
I didn't know that. Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. Huh. So let's talk about the Solutions Journalism Network. I know that's your current passion. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so so there's a bit of a backstory. In 2010, my colleague Tina Rosenberg, who's one of the journalists that I most admire in the world, called me up and said, "Would you like to propose a column to the New York Times that would focus on reporting about solutions?" And I had done a number of books that looked at solutions, including the one about social entrepreneurship and the one about the Grameen Bank. Tina had written a lot of magazine articles for the New York Times and had also written books. And she was also becoming interested in how journalism can describe efforts to improve the world without falling into sort of a hero kind of story, like a CNN hero frame, which is not really the way we like to tell stories in hard news formats. So we proposed to the Times, they accepted it. We started this column, we called it Fixes, and we've been doing it now for 11 years. What we saw in the first couple of years, like even after year one or year two, was that these stories did really well. People were hungry to hear about how are people solving problems. And even when they were unattractive subjects like the foster care system, homelessness, trauma, malaria, stuff like that, you would get on the most emailed list. There was this sense that people are hungry to learn about how the world can be improved, but they don't want simple pablum. They want really thoughtful ideas that explore the how-tos. And that was the core insight. The light bulb went off that said, this is a journalistic gap right now. Journalism is not producing this product, which is very much wanted and very much needed. And it's depressing everybody and polarizing everybody and making people so fearful that they're becoming more, everybody's circling the wagons, as we can see right now in America. So there was a real social dimension to this. And that's where we launched the network and said, let's train news organizations or even invite them to think differently about the future of journalism. Does it always have to be telling people what's wrong? Or is there a way that journalism can be used without advocating for ideas to illuminate pathways and possibilities that can help people and enlarge sort of our moral imagination? So the network started. We were a couple of people. We were a nonprofit. We got some grant funding. And over the last 8 years, we've grown a lot. We have 50 staff now. We've trained more than 500 news organizations, engaged with over 20,000 journalists, 130 journalism schools. And the category solutions journalism is now a viable, legitimate, acceptable category. The BBC uses it, The Guardian, the New York Times, public radio across the country. I mean, it really is an emerging new balance to journalism that I think, I'm hopeful will redress a lot of the problems that journalism has and some of the problems that journalism has created, which we can talk about, related to things like equity and narratives that are very harmful to lots of people.
Yeah, let's spend a minute on that, because I think that is really interesting. That I believe, I can't remember whether it was you or another journalist was writing about the preponderance of coverage of things like violence in poor communities, which gives everybody the impression that that's the bulk of what's going on there. And yet clearly that can't be, or there wouldn't be many of those communities left.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, and you can, you can go to the New York Times, you can go to the Philadelphia Inquirer and type in the New York Times, you can type in Brownsville, Brooklyn. In the Philadelphia Inquirer, you could type in, say, Kensington, Philadelphia. And you'll see over the last 5 or 10 years, the majority of stories, if not, and in some cases, a dramatic majority of stories will be about violence and crime. So the question is, what is the effect of only reflecting back negative things, pathologies, victim, predatory behavior, all that stuff in communities of color, or in some cases, communities that have long experienced poverty? What's the effect? And the effect, and this is something, I don't know if you've visited the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, the Equal Justice Initiative, the National Peace and Justice Memorial, which is sometimes called the Lynching Memorial, which is associated with a museum that chronicles slavery to mass incarceration and how that happened in the United States. And one of the main takeaways is that there has been a narrative of the sort of lawlessness, the dangerousness of quote unquote Black people that has been perpetuated and authored. And in many cases, journalism has been one of the primary sources for those narratives. And that's chronicled very, very carefully in the museum. So you can see the history of journalism creating and perpetuating narratives. We can go all the way up to the wolf pack descriptions from the Central Park jogger, and even some of the characterizations of protesters after the murder of George Floyd, to see how these narratives get perpetuated in the media by virtue of its focus. And it's really some real blind spots in terms of what it's leaving out of the coverage. So our work in the Solutions Journalism Network is to go into news organizations and to say, when you go into any community, you should be looking for capacity and agency and aspirations, not just pathology and deficits and victimhood. If you're only looking for the germs, or so to speak, and you never look for the antibodies, you're going to continuously slander some of the most vulnerable communities in the country and create in the public mind a kind of moral justification for these racist policies that we've seen for generations. So journalism is really complicit in this, and we're working very hard, and a lot of other news organizations are working very hard to change this.
I think that's inspiring. And so why do you suppose that is? Does it really sell more papers, or cause more clicks, or get more eyeballs, or where did that all come from?
No, the research really shows, like our research and research we've done with or universities have done about solutions journalism, says that solutions journalism does very well. It plays very well. Outrage plays very well, but so do stories that are very helpful. The kinds of stories that people share very often are, send this to all my friends who are teachers, or send this to all my friends who are in healthcare, because it's a really interesting idea. So there's not really, if it bleeds, it leads. If it succeeds, it leads too. I mean, you can create all sorts of products that do well. The journalism behavior, there's this old phrase in journalism that comes from Justice Brandeis from more than 100 years ago, which is, sunlight is said to be the best disinfectant. And journalists have taken that to be like, our job is to kill the germs. We should be disinfectant. We should go out and look for bad guys and corruption and hunt out the dark corners and where things are going wrong. And our theory of change is that if we show people how bad things are, the world will get better. And that is really a kind of implicit, very unexamined assumption that drives a lot of journalistic behavior. Of course, we would want a real behavior, a real theory of change would be like, if we show people how bad things are and what's possible to improve them, the world will get better. That would probably be a more complete theory of change. And that's the second part of that. So if sunlight is the best disinfectant was the 20th century, you could look to Eleanor Roosevelt and say, it's better to light a candle than curse the darkness. Show people what's possible instead of just freaking them out like a beeping smoke alarm every time something goes wrong. Mm-hmm. And that's really, in some ways, it's rebalancing the news. I mean, this goes back to the advent of the telegraph. Journalism became really focused on crime and violence from a distance to sell newspapers after the Telegraph and the penny press, where there was this great need to, feature scandals from Ohio in New York City in order to build the Pulitzer empires and so forth. But that's, we've outgrown that.
I think that's brilliant. So you talk about sort of what makes a good solutions journalism, and there's a list of characteristics that I think are really interesting. And the first one is to spread promising practices. And I recall Chip and Dan Heath talking about, find out the bright spots, and then see what works, and then spread those rather than deciding what might work. And this, they were talking about it particularly with respect to, aid situations where you're going into an impoverished village and trying to tackle, say, child malnutrition. And their argument was, well, why make up in your head what you think the answer is and try to impose it on these people? Why don't you go find out where, solutions already exist and spread those? And I think that's really interesting, this notion of find what works and then see where it might apply to some other places. So I think there was a quarterly report that the network put out, and there was a case of using, I think it was using ex-felons to try to break a cycle of retributive gun violence. Rather than police. So, and that one city copied another one in doing this practice, and I think it prevented 18 murders.
This is a perfect example. And what Chip and Dan Heath wrote about with the bright spots, we're very influenced by the same people that they were influenced by, which is the Positivedeviance research. I think they reported on work that was done in Vietnam many years ago, where they found mothers in very poor villages that managed to provide better nutrition for their children in the context of deep poverty. And they looked at how this works. Not Chip and Dan Heath, but I think it was CARE or Save the Children, one of these NGOs that did that. Our work is very much focused on identifying positive deviance. In some ways, most journalism is about identifying negative deviance. It's like, where is the worst actor? What is the worst police department doing racial profiling? What is the worst polluting company? And then go do a big investigation and sort of blame and shame them, and then the law comes in and hopefully people get punished and all that stuff. The positive deviance approach is to notice, as you were saying, what's working. And in every community across the country, I mean, COVID was a great example because every community had to try to improvise better a safety net. How do we bring in systems of care and compassion when people can't physically meet, and so forth. And some communities did way better than others. So those are the teachers. Those are the people who you tell the stories. This is how they did it. In some cases, they did it with very minimal resources. So even better, you can copy that. But that, I remember interviewing a guy who ran the Positive Parenting program. This is an Australian gentleman. And he had run this program for 30 years, and he had trained, gazillion parents in how to be better parents. And I said, teach me, what's the secret to good parenting? Teach, while I stand on one foot kind of thing. And he said basically, catch kids doing the right thing and let them know you saw them, right? So it's basically positive deviance. Notice what's working. Whatever you focus on will grow. It's kind of a law, it's like photosynthesis. Whatever the sunlight is on will get the nutrients. And it's a really interesting thought when you think about what we put our attention on when we go to Twitter and Facebook and our news feeds. It's in some cases, if a bomb goes off anywhere in the world of 8 billion people, this is what we will be reading about, right? I mean, this is a really big planet and there's a lot of crazy things going on. But as you said, there's probably a lot more social entrepreneurs than terrorists. It's probably not even close. And yet, what fills our imaginations every day? And also what's the health impact of what we focus on,
Absolutely. Well, and the other thing that you point out,
we have a database. We have a database at the Solutions Journalism Network. We call it the Solutions Story Tracker, and we do it by hand. There's no automation here, and we have 12,000 stories of solutions in there that we have found from more than 1,000 news organizations around the world, looking at things that are working. So if you're a student or you're looking to say, hey, what's working around this issue or this issue, it's all tagged. You can find the positive deviants that are emerging around the world. It's not exhaustive by any means. It's a handmade thing, but it's a glimpse into what is being born, right now, that is hopeful. What is sprouting that we can build upon or we can learn from.
I love that. I absolutely love that. The other thing that you point out, and I had Tim Harford, the data detective, as a guest some months back, and he said, as he sees it, one of the problems with news, and he's very interested in statistics and how we interpret data and what stories we tell from data, and he said, the fact that 150,000 people got lifted out of poverty yesterday is a very interesting and important piece of information, but it's not news. And you seem to be challenging that.
Well, that's the thing. You see, it can be news, right? Saying it happened, it's hard for people to lean into that. They don't even know. It's like saying 40,000 planes landed yesterday, right?
Right, right.
So that's cool. Now, if the rate of plane crashes has gone down, that's a really interesting story. If the rate of homicides have gone down, if the way that kids are getting out of poverty, if we can understand this is how poverty is being alleviated today, it's different than the way it was being alleviated 10 years ago. These are the mechanisms. What people are more interested in than the fact of something that's working is really the engineering behind it. I mean, if you think about the most popular TV shows, or at least the ones that were the most popular for 20 years, they were what they called these TV procedurals, like Law and Order, CSI, Special Victims Unit. Basically, they were all like Sherlock Holmes. They started with a problem. Someone committed a crime, TV shows like House, the baby is sick. And then the whole show is, how are they going to solve this problem? How are they going to do it? So we call it a how done it. Solutions journalism is like a how done it. The question is not, did crime go down, or the school dropout rate, or the school graduation rate has increased. The question is, how did this school deal with a really tough problem? What did they do? And I guarantee, as a journalist, if you look at that kind of question, if you start your question with the word how, you will almost always end up with something interesting. They did something interesting. They did something counterintuitive. They did something that no one had thought of doing before, or that other schools. In many cases, you get an insight that can be widely shared with a whole field and improve people's performance in many, many cases. But the how-to stories, I mean, journalism has the 5 W's for anyone who's gone to journalism school. There's no how in there, right? And you think about, that's a real omission, because it's the how-to questions where we engage people through their problem solving and their curiosity, rather than their lawyer mind, which is all about defending their position. Think about when you engage people through asking them to defend their position, you're setting up the stage for a binary conflict, which is exactly what journalism does every single day. It asks people, which side of the line do you stand on? Rather than, how would you solve this problem? Or are you curious about how this school that doesn't have a lot of resources managed to increase its graduation rate by 30% over the last 2 years? Wouldn't you want to know how they did that? Right? Anybody who's curious, who likes to do Sudoku or crossword puzzles, is interested in these kinds of questions, because it's all about puzzles, and we love puzzles.
Absolutely. So when you go into a news organization, generic local news place, what does that look like? What is that curriculum like?
Yeah, so initially we got a lot of crossed arms.
I bet. Because you really are challenging some of the major orthodoxies, right? Yeah, I mean, sure. I think in 8th grade, I got the W's, banged into my head.
That's right. And the idea that if you say anything good about anyone, you've become an advocate. That if you say this school did something interesting and their graduation rate increased by 30%, and here's how they did it, somehow your editor is going to say you're not allowed to tell that story. If the graduation rate went down, you can write that story. That's a good critical piece. But if the graduation rate went up, then you're advocating for the school. I mean, it makes no sense. So a lot of the things early in our history, it was really, let's think through some of these assumptions. They're unexamined, and people would be like, that's true, I never thought of it that way. And then once we started getting journalists on board and good newsrooms, we started producing with them, or they started producing the solutions journalism. through the training. And then we had lots and lots of teachable examples and many, many awards and Pulitzer finalists and all sorts of things like that. So that makes it really easy. But the training at first is really, there's a why and a how to the training. The first is, why do we need to understand the way stories land on people? And in some ways, it's kind of like behavioral economics. It's like, we can't just treat people as econs that are rational actors all the time, and you can just tell them 100 times that climate change is destroying the earth, and this is not going to cause them to bury their heads in the sand. You have to understand people. You have to understand the way information lands on human beings and what it's going to do to them. And is it going to cause distortions? Is it going to cause undue fear? Is it going to cause them to deny the message, as we have seen with climate change over and over, right? So that's the why. And also, is it going to contribute to racism, which is a really big question? Is this going to make us slander and disinvest in communities because we think there's no capacity there, because we've never written about the capacity in those communities? I mean, so the why is bring up some of these questions. And then the how is really where we get into the principles of, this is just good journalism. Report, looking for evidence, looking for insights, describing the process, looking for the limitations, making sure that you're not overselling or overclaiming. If it's just a small study, saying it's just a small study, this is not conclusive data, but it is promising. And a year from now, we're going to follow up and see if it's good, humble description of processes to solve problems without overclaiming, my problem, I would say, if I went back to rewrite How to Change the World, there's probably some overclaiming in that book that I would cringe at a little bit when I look at it today. Like, some of these things I was a little hypey on, which and the other thing is, there's too much focus on individuals and not enough on teams and the organizational qualities. It was too much of sort of heroic visionary individuals in that book. And that's something now that in solutions journalism, we actually ask people to avoid. The idea is the hero. The idea is the hero.
Oh, I love that.
You tell that story well, you explain something that 1 million people might benefit from. How many parents could benefit from, catch kids doing the right thing and let them know you saw them? That's a really skeleton key kind of advice that has helped me in my life as a father.
Absolutely. And I think what's also fascinating about a lot of these stories is, I think we're used to thinking of these quite difficult social problems as so intractable. They're just so big, and it's like you need an army to go and address them. And yet a lot of the things you're finding are not extensive, and they're not even particularly difficult. But you need to know they exist, a lot of those solutions, which
and of course,
I think it's fascinating.
If you, most of the time when you look at almost any solution and you say, did it work? The answer is yes and no. Some of the pieces of it worked beautifully, and some of the pieces of it, the assumptions were totally wrong. Some of the pieces of it worked really well, but it's too expensive to scale, or it's politically impossible to move. So what you end up doing is you end up getting into a conversation in the story of, it's kind of like iterations. How do you continue to try to move the ball forward? And can this solution be replicated, or is it too dependent on this one principal or this one hospital administrator or whatever? So you begin to look at, like, what are the teachable lessons buried in these stories that can make other people across that industry or even across society better informed about even thinking about problem solving, can spur their creativity or imagination. Because there's always pieces of things, even in total failures, there's very often pieces that worked. It's just that something bigger didn't work.
Or something was missing.
Right. And you almost never find a perfect solution. There are no perfect solutions. There are no complete solutions. The best solutions are often impossible to scale at the level of need, because they're usually, very, very well done, which means that there's a lot of invested in them. But the whole way of thinking about, how do we actually improve systems? How do we solve problems? And how do we mobilize the belief and the energy in society for people to stop just arguing with one another over first principles and actually collaborate on things that they could do together. Because across these huge partisan divides that we see together, there's actually a lot of common values. It doesn't seem that, but you have to hunt for that. But when you get to the local level of news, it's amazing how popular solution stories are. And typically, they're not partisan stories. People don't, are not going to get into a huge political argument over like a question like, how did this school increase its graduation rate? They'll be like, tell me how.
Right.
It's the engineering part of the brain. It's not the lawyer part of the brain. It's not,
I love that. I absolutely love that.
Yeah, it likes to scribble on napkins.
Mm-hmm. And one of our longtime listeners, Frank Kalberg, wants to know, do some national cultures focus more on positive deviance? Have you observed that at all?
Good question. I would say probably the United States is at the forefront of that. I would say that India has a very strong focus on, there's a real inclination to look for what's working. I mean, they've had a lot of success, obviously in science and tech. And then there are some cultures that it's very hard to talk to the journalists about solutions journalism, because the idea that we are at heart meant to criticize. And even if we think about how this connects to academia, we talk so much about critical thinking in academia. We don't talk as much about constructive thinking, about what is the kind of thinking that leads us to build better things. And you see a lot of students who can demolish arguments, just they're so good at that, but have they really been trained to think of what's a better alternative? Let's think about that. And in some ways, I think journalists fall into the same problem. There's even a lot of journalists that think that, people think you're smarter if you're more critical, which is true. There's social science that supports that.
Right?
Journalists like to be thought of as smart. So, but it's very culturally supported too. Almost all the Pulitzer Prizes go to investigative journalism that is really, really attacking something that's bad. And that's, that's a real cultural value that we're working against. We have to figure out how to align. And just by the way, when you do solutions journalism well, it actually sharpens the accountability. There's nothing that makes poor performance less legitimate than showing that something better is possible. It creates competitive pressures. Why aren't we doing what that school is doing? Why aren't we doing what that hospital is doing or that police department is doing? Takes away the excuses. And that's where it blends with investigative journalism and can really do a 1-2 punch.
That's the great idea. It's very profound. I mean, when I think about some of the things that started, some of the breakthroughs and insights that we learned that took forever to diffuse. I'm thinking of things like hand washing in hospitals. There was evidence decades before it became a widespread and well-accepted practice. And it seems to me this approach to journalism might help speed up some of those diffusion curves for good practices.
That's such a important point, what you just said. We have a whole bunch of stories about hand washing in our fixes column in the New York Times. My colleague Tina has done, I don't know how many, but a bunch of them. All the ways that hospitals are trying and have tried to increase hand washing. Now think about it. Hand washing is a really hard problem. Like, have you ever washed your hands 100 times a day? It's not fun. It's hard to remember. Your skin gets chafed. You're in a rush all the time to go see this patient. It's so easy to skip that one step. And so there's all sorts of, there's data that shows that if you place the hand washing machine here instead of 3 feet to the right, you increase hand washing by 30%, stuff like that. There's, so the creativity that has to go into managing this difficult thing called behavior change, which is one of the hardest problems to solve in almost any field. Behavior change is almost always the last mile once you have the technology.
Right.
So there's so much creativity around behavior change today. And it's a really, we know much more we know much more about what leads to behavior change. This is what Chip and Dan have written about in their books so much. How do we actually get people to switch their behavior from X to Y. Well, we can tweak that, but it's the creativity and how people are playing with those insights is truly fascinating. And you could just read these stories over and over again. It's like it's because it's really looking at and these are really big problems. People die from infections.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And hospital-borne infections. I mean, and it really ties together with some other topics that I find fascinating. Some is, the work of Atul Gawande on things as simple as a checklist, but then the social engineering that Amy Edmondson talks about, which is great. You have a checklist. Who's going to call the doctor on following it? Well, put the nurses in charge of it, which creates a leveling of power and much more of this, she calls it psychological safety, to be able to say, hey, this isn't working. And she's done massive amounts of research, a lot of it in hospital settings, showing that things like, wrongly administered drugs and things that are very catchable errors slide through nonetheless, because someone who saw it didn't feel empowered to say anything.
That's right. Yeah.
And I think that's a really kind of interesting parallel concept to, once we know what the solution is, how do we now make it real in the world? And I think that's a big challenge. Really
powerful insight. The patient safety movement is one of the most fascinating ones. I don't know if you've followed the work of the 100,000 Lives campaign, which became the 5 Million Lives campaign. It was led by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, but it was all about behavior change. And it was around things like surgical site infections, like which surgeons have the lowest infection rates. Did they bring their backpack into the operating room? Did they actually change their scrubs? Did they wear the same shoes that they wore in the sheet? So hospitals that have reduced this have done things like posting the infection rate on top of the operating room door. Surgeons do not like to see that their infection rate is higher than another surgeon. So there's just like using human nature, in a really creative way. And some of these problems are, they're solved. There are hospitals in this country that have incredibly low sepsis rates, and other hospitals that have really high sepsis rates. And this is something that is incredibly deadly to children, especially, but kills, close to 300,000 people a year. And some places are like, which hospital would you like to go to? The one that's figured out how to check for this when you immediately check in, or the one that doesn't? There's huge performance variance. If you want to think about the variation under the curve, the positive deviants are at one end of the curve, the negative deviants are at the under end of the curve. The negative deviants are where we mobilize outrage, the ones that kill the most people. The positive deviants are where we mobilize knowledge, learning how to save people. You need them both.
Yeah. I'm reminded of something that took place in the Koch administration. So we're going back, decades, in the city of New York. And at the time, the city, the way procurement in the city worked is you had your goods delivered, and then you could invoice the city and then they would pay you. But it took an incredibly long time for the vendors to get paid. And so a lot of these little vendors were going under because they were out the cash flow required to produce the goods, and the city wouldn't pay them for months and months and months. And so when Koch came in, one of his campaign pledges was he was going to cut down this vendor payments movement. And he could have done any number of things. He could have hired McKinsey, he could have brought in teams of consultants, but he hired one guy. His name was Marty Weiss, who happened to be a friend of mine. And Marty was an accountant and with a bit of an engineering background. And all he did was he went around to every single of 121 city agencies and put in a system which could measure the time between they received the invoice and the time the payment went out the door. And he got all the commissioners of all those entities to agree that those data were valid. And he took about 6-7 months to do this. And Koch was like, great. And then what he did was he took the slowest paying agency and the name of the commissioner all the way down to the fastest paying agency and the name of the commissioner, and put it on a full page in the New York Post. And he was like, I don't care how you do it. You figure it out. Your name is staying on that list until you get this problem solved. And I thought that was one of the most brilliant mobilizations of public resources ever. And they almost got to a point where they were then paying too fast because then there was, they didn't have the cash flow to play with. But it was that same principle, right?
Yes.
And using it. I mean, one of the things that I've been so frustrated by, I do a fair amount of work in the not-for-profit sector, and you want to solve, I don't know, girls dropping out of high school. And so one group does it by Zumba classes, and another group does it by yoga, and another one does it through art, and another one does it through computer programming. And there doesn't seem to be any mechanism where we step back and we say, okay, it's great that people have that variety of options to choose from. I'm not saying cut down the options, but is there something about one or another of these programs that actually accomplishes the goal better than others? And it sounds to me almost as you've got a bit of the infrastructure started to begin to do some of that.
Yeah, so as you were saying, feedback mechanisms are really important, what you were describing. So journalism is a feedback mechanism, right? We're in the business of providing society with feedback about this isn't working, this is working. So one of the basis, of the solutions journalism approach is that if you go to your editor and you say, I'd like to write about this, to use the same example, this school that has really improved its graduation rate, your editor is going to say, why this school, right? Do you just know the principal? Do you have a friend who works there? I mean, they're going to say, like, what's the basis for writing about this school? And that's where you say, well, according to the data, I looked at 20 schools in our community, and this school has the best increase of all the schools, according to looking back the last 3 or 5 years or so. So once you have, data and evidence, then you can say, okay, well, let's look inside the black box and see how did they get this improvement. It could be, well, it's a rich school. It has more resources than another school. So it could be that, in which case you say, well, I'm going to, bring that into my analysis. But once you bring evidence into the question, then you start saying, well, we're not just going to write about Zumba because it sounds like a cool idea or it's catchy. We're actually going to look at what works. We're going to start with what's the result that they got as best as we can ascertain it. Now, for very early stage things, journalism likes to do things fast. We like to get scoops. You often don't have very good data and evidence in an early stage. You have anecdotes, right? You have the teachers say this, the nurses say this, and you can base it on that. But as you move further along, especially when you're getting to stories that look at the level of cities or even state level interventions, there's usually a lot of administrative data that you can look at and say, we can evaluate these 10 approaches to that problem, and we can say that these are the ones we'll focus on. You can also in a solutions journalism story focus on these approaches which draw a lot of money, but aren't producing good results, but they keep getting their budget renewed every year because of the way we do budgets. We don't like to, once it's in the budget kind of thing. So evidently important, for innovation. Is it coming through? I'm telling you.
We lost you for just a sec, but you're good now.
Yeah, but and once again, this, evidence can be manufactured. There's all sorts of different ways that studies can be made. There's, people argue about, is this evidence all the time. It's not a cut and dry thing, but in general, that would be one of the greatest improvements in the nonprofit sector, would be less doing things because we were emotionally attached to them, and more doing them because they actually produce the results that we hope for.
Right. And I think, I work in, I try to work with strategy for non-for-profits, and you even bring up the subject of what's your strategy, and they kind of look at you like, what? But when I look at the ones that are really effective, and I'm thinking of, Harlem Children's Zone as an example, very clear about here's the class of problems we're going to focus on. And in that particular case, I'm sure you're familiar with them, but they have their geographic boundary, and within that boundary, they are like, from the time somebody gets pregnant all the way through the application to college, they do like everything that you can think of for these kids. And the goal, it's very interesting to me what their goal is, because their goal is not to produce, future Einsteins. Their goal is to say, okay, here's an area that has a lot of challenges, financial and other. And what we want for these kids is to do as well as kids in a typical American community would do. And I thought that was so interesting. They're ambitious, but not absurdly so, and very focused. And I think a lot of social causes would benefit from that kind of clarity of strategy and clarity of focus. So some of the other components you talk about in terms of what what social solutions journalism can do. So we talked about spreading promising practices. Another one that I thought was interesting was changing laws, policies, and practices. Are there any great examples of that you could share?
Of
changing laws, policies, and practices.
Solutions journalism doing that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's lots of examples. I mean, nothing. Well, you know, for example, there was a series that was done a number of years ago in the Chattanooga Times Free Press called The Poverty Puzzle. And I'm bringing it up because I love to bring attention to this, because it was one of the great examples of solution journalism, showing how hard it is to do it on an issue like poverty at the level of a city. It was a year-long thing. It was a Pulitzer finalist. And what grew out of that was a deep recognition of the many different ways that people in the community were trying to address poverty, you know, through certain programs, mentoring programs, educational programs, job training programs, and the challenges and the opportunities that were baked into each of those. That led a number of major institutions in the city to shift their approaches and to even shift in terms of who was on the city council, bring in people who had different voices, and some of this more shop floor level experience in terms of attacking the problem. And we've seen this in a lot of cases. Another big byproduct of solution journalism, and I would say this is one of the major mechanisms, is it gets to what you were talking about before, major mechanisms by which it has impact. When you show what's happening in one community, other communities say, oh, where's ours? So for example, San Francisco is one of the leading communities in the United States to really rethink the way it does fines and fees, and how much fines and fees really land on the poorest people in San Francisco in a very unfair way. And so they rethought the basis of their fines and fees, all sorts of kinds of fines and fees. I mean, there's so many ways that governments do that. And WBEZ in Chicago decided to do a similar series looking at that problem in Chicago. They actually looked at San Francisco's approach. So they sort of, it's what in business, I guess you would call idea importation, or idea, I forget the term, where you bring in an idea from another place and then you sort of recreate it. It's kind of like what businesses do all the time. They steal.
Well, businesses call it best practices.
Best practices.
Which is problematic, but we can get into that in another time. But yeah, the idea is like you look at what your neighbor's doing and you say, oh, I'll do that. I'm fascinated at how, you know, with the big tech companies, right? So somebody pops up with a newsletter and before you know it, there's like 8 newsletter platforms that are out there.
You go to these big tech conferences in Las Vegas, you know, everybody goes, all these entrepreneurs go, and they come back and they steal 10 ideas and recreate their products based on what they've seen. So this kind of cross-pollination of innovation, you think of journalists as bees in a way. You know, what we're doing is we're going to one place, taking something, highlighting it, and making it available to other places. And then the mapping of innovation, COVID was a perfect example, because rarely do you have the whole world trying to solve the same problem, right? And you know, many dimensions of that, but you have thousands of communities in the United States that were trying to figure out some of the really same basic things. So who are the teachers, and who gets the talking stick, and who gets to listen at the feet of people who have more experience or tried something that was more successful? This idea of continual learning for innovation, and journalism being a feedback system that supports that process, rather than just causing people to sort of disengage or fear, or, you know, the number of people who've told me during COVID, I stopped watching the news.
I stopped watching the news. Yeah, I read your piece on that. That was fascinating.
The CDC was telling people to limit their news consumption for their health. I mean, this is, so yeah. So this is on the, you know, you have a product that, you know, if you know, the FDA would say this pill might not be, you know, good for your health. You might not want to consume it, kind of thing. You have to think about, like, what is it that we're putting out there, and what are the assumptions that we have that we should just be not concerned at all about the health or mental health effects of our product. Makes no sense. Really.
That is super interesting. So can you spend a minute on, you know, you've been in the news business a long time. how do you see it evolving? Do you see this? I mean, some of what you've written suggests this might be an actual growth trajectory for journalism as a, as a, I'll call it a neutral arbiter of identifying what works. And I think that's what gives it a lot of power. You're not selling something, you're reporting on something, which I think is a big difference.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many changes happening, but the biggest fundamental economic change in the news business is, sort of the collapse of the advertising model and the collapse of the bundled product. So now people, the unit of engagement is the story.
Mhm.
It's not the New York
Yeah.
Times, it's not the Washington Post. And the customer chooses, and they have all the power now. So you now have a product that people used to consume. People would buy the entire New York Times and read, a couple of things. And they'd buy this bundled thing. Now the customer is choosing what to read, and the business model is moving towards the customer pays. In other words, subscription fees, membership fees, and things like that. Now, if you're asking me to pay at the level of the story in some cases, or at the level of this, the product deficiencies suddenly become really, very, very salient, right? So so if you survey 100 people about journalism, and this has been done many times, and say, what do you think of the news? You get a whole bunch of people saying, it makes me feel depressed, it makes me feel powerless, and I don't know if I can trust it. These are the top 3 reasons, according to the Reuters Institute, that people are currently avoiding the news, and increasingly avoiding the news every time they do the survey. Okay, so now you have a product. Imagine going to a restaurant where people said, every time I eat your food, I feel depressed and powerless. And you're like, why don't you come more often? It's like, right? So you're like, the product itself has deficiencies. Now, news still has to be realistic. We can't just be giving people sunny stories about the world. The world has lots of problems, but you can be giving people stories about the world that help them understand the nature of the problems, and stories about the world that help them understand what we can do about them, what's emerging, what's possible, what's intriguing, what are the insights. If that becomes the product, the news product, and then you're asking people to pay for it, people will say, well, yes, this makes me feel powerful. It feeds my sense of efficacy. It helps me understand how our community can get better. It doesn't make me feel like, I want to go have like 2 tequilas after I, read it, kind of thing. So it's the product stupid, to quote Bill Clinton, or paraphrase Bill Clinton. It would be my message for journalism, like, ask people what they think of the product. If you're going to ask them to pay for it, directly pay for our product instead of getting a third-party payer who's the advertiser. You're going to have to say, is this an instant coffee that you won't buy for 50 cents, or is this a latte that you want to pay $5 for? I mean, think about it. If it's a different product, it has a different economic life. Mm-hmm. And we now know that people really want information to help them feel a sense of control in the world. That's why a lot of research shows that that's why people believe in conspiracy theories. It actually makes them feel a greater sense of control about this crazy world that makes them feel a little bit, too out of control. And so,
well, it gives them the sense that they're in on something that other people don't know about, right?
Yeah, something like that. I'm not an expert on conspiracy theories. I've read a few of these pieces of research that suggests that the deep feeling of powerlessness and lack of control is one of the driver. It was certainly, according to the RAND, the people who said people like me have no say were by far the most likely voters for Donald Trump in 2016. It wasn't even close. Mm-hmm. So a sense of powerlessness or a sense of voicelessness was very much associated with the particular appeal of his candidacy. Mm-hmm. Journalism feeds that powerlessness and that sense of voicelessness. So we, to some degree, own that candidacy as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I think I've been very taken by with many of the stories that the Solutions Journalism Network has flagged is this notion of there are things you can do. So one that comes to mind just as we're moving toward the end of our time together is there was this group in Baltimore, which I want to thread something.
Yeah,
thread.
I've written about them a couple of times. Yeah.
But what was so interesting to me about that was the way that they framed it is, if all you have is 10 minutes a day, here's how you can get involved. You know, if all you have is $2, here's how you can get involved. If all you have is, you know, 4 hours on a weekend, here's how you can get involved. And what I loved about that was you could feel you were part of something bigger than yourself. You could make it work within whatever constraints you were operating under. And the output, the effect was visible, and you could see it and you could be part of it. I thought that was great. Maybe just tell that story quickly.
Well, the thing that Thread does that people don't believe, I actually wrote 2 Fixes columns about it because I was so fascinated by the approach, is they work with young kids in the Baltimore public schools. They focus on the kids who are doing the worst in 9th grade. I believe, I think they start in 9th grade, the kids who are at the bottom, which means these are the kids who usually have the least supports in their lives. They often have really difficult family situations. Some of them are homeless. And they focus on these kids, and they basically say, we are going to provide you with mentorship for, I believe it's 10 years, you know, and they enlist volunteer mentors at like a ratio of 5 to 1. And these kids, like, they basically say, you cannot get out of Thread, you know, no matter
Once
what
you're
you do,
in.
you will be taken care of. You will have people calling to check up on you, people knocking on your door to wake you up, to bring you to school if you can't get up on time, people, you know, having conversations with you, tutoring, whatever your needs are. And you say, like, how can they guarantee 10 years of support for this kid, no matter what happens? And then how do you build a volunteer system around that? Because a lot of their volunteers are Johns Hopkins students, so they have exams. I mean, there's lots of things that make it really a hard problem, you know, like a FedEx level problem to solve. It's complicated. And they've managed to pull this together and create so many redundancies in their system that the support always comes through. And then speaking to the volunteers and speaking to the students, what you realize is it is possible to, you know, to create a level of kind of compassion and care, you know, through this, in this case, a volunteer mentor network that I would have said before I researched it wasn't possible. It changed my sense of what we can do. It elevated my sort of moral imagination of what our society or what our communities can do. And that's a really powerful story. When you give people an insight, we might be a lot better than we think.
I love that. I absolutely love that. And I love your concept of journalism being about activating people to be powerful players in a participative democracy. I think that's great. So how can we help? How can we learn more? How can we help?
Well, anybody, if you're a journalist or an editor, or you're working in a news organization, we would love to partner with you. That's what we do. If you're if you are just interested in learning about solutions, go to the Solution Story Tracker, or put stories into the Solution Story Tracker if you know of some of them that you think we should have in there. We are, you know, like I say, we're now developing a network model, so we're working with lots of journalism schools. If there are educators out there that would like to bring solutions journalism into the classroom in their J school, and in general, if you're a news consumer, if you can find ways to advocate on social media or to your favorite news organization and say, journalism needs to change. This is a really important idea. You know, you know, if the audience demands a better news product and says, we're willing to pay for it, we want it. And if that becomes known, then journalism will change. It really needs to, it's really being driven by the choice of the audience right now more than anything else.
I love that.
That's a big thing.
Well, there's a social movement you could really get behind.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. This time has just flown. You let me know how I can help, you know, just with whatever my platform is. I'd be thrilled. And to be continued, I hope.
Thank you, Rita. I will, and I'll follow up with you. Thanks so much.
Great. Thank you.